The morning sun hung heavy over Ashwood Estate as though even the sky disapproved of what was about to happen. Elena Whitmore stood at the tall window of her childhood bedroom, watching strangers decorate the garden with silk ribbons and white chairs her family could barely afford. It should have been the happiest day of her life, but to her it felt like a funeral. Behind her, the sharp voice of her stepmother Vivian sliced through the silence, reminding her that the dress was on the bed and the stylist would arrive soon. Elena's fingers gripped the windowsill, her heart whispering that she could still run away. But Vivian's cold laugh crushed the thought, telling her there was nowhere to go. The papers were signed, the guests had arrived, and her father's debts left no choice. Elena turned, her green eyes meeting the hard gaze of the woman who had never loved her. She asked why Nicholas Hale, and Vivian's answer was simple: because the Hale family had money, power, and because Edward Whitmore was drowning in debt. Dilo, sir. Sound of tires on gravel twisted Elena's stomach as a black car arrived. Nicholas Hale stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered in a tailored suit, his piercing blue eyes fixed ahead, every inch of him radiating control. Vivian called him handsome, but Elena saw only coldness. Beauty would not pay the debts, but his wealth would. When Vivian left, Elena sat on the edge of her bed where the ivory gown lay waiting. She thought of her late mother Isabel, a gifted pianist who had filled this home with music until illness silenced her forever. In her final days, she had whispered strange names Elena never understood, secrets carried to the grave. Elena's heart ached as she asked silently what her mother would have done. Her father Edward entered quietly, shoulders bent beneath years of regret. He told her he wished there was another way, but Elena pleaded that they could sell the estate, start anew. Edward shook his head, explaining that the debts were deeper than she knew, and without this marriage they would lose everything. He told her she didn't deserve to pay for his mistakes, but Elena's voice broke with the truth that this marriage was making her pay anyway. Edward flinched, saying Nicholas could give her security, but when she asked about love, his eyes dimmed with a lie. He claimed love could grow after, yet Elena remembered her mother's hidden letters to a man named Richard, proof that Isabel had lived with quiet sorrow, trapped in choices she had never wanted. Elena slipped into the gown, its silk cold against her skin, the pearl necklace forced upon her by Vivian heavy like a chain. Downstairs the music began. Guests filled the garden with artificial cheer, and Edward offered her his arm with a fragile smile. She whispered she was not ready, but still stepped forward. The doors opened, and Nicholas Hale stood at the altar, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady and composed. Elena walked toward him, every step carrying her further from freedom. When the vows were spoken, she forced her voice to remain steady and said the words, "I do." In that moment she knew she was lying to him, to herself, and to God. What no one else knew was that this loveless marriage would ignite secrets, betrayals, and passions powerful enough to destroy them all. The reception was over, the forced smiles, and hollow congratulations fading into silence as Elena found herself alone in the master bedroom of the Hale mansion. The room was vast and cold, with walls of glass that overlooked the glittering city below, so different from the warmth of Ashwood Estate where she had grown up. Her wedding gown now hung in the closet like a ghost, and she stood in a white silk nightgown Vivian had insisted she wear, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her heart tighten. Nicholas Hale was coming. The door opened and he entered quietly, his jacket and tie gone, the first buttons of his shirt undone, his dark hair slightly tousled as though he had run, his hands through it more than once. His presence filled the room, commanding yet strangely hesitant. He looked at her with eyes that were no longer cold, but shadowed by something she couldn't name. He spoke softly, saying he thought she would already be asleep. She admitted she couldn't, her voice unsteady as she asked why he had taken so long. He paused before answering, confessing that he had been thinking about what had happened, about them. For the first time since she had known him, there was honesty in his tone, and it unsettled her. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, as though afraid she might run. He told her he knew this wasn't what she wanted. She gave a bitter smile and asked if it was what he wanted. His blue eyes studied her, Then he admitted that he no longer knew what he wanted at all. The words surprised her more than anything else that day. The silence between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. She could hear her heart pounding, certain he could hear it too. Then he asked quietly if she was afraid of him. She asked if she should be. He answered firmly, never. Now he was close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something purely masculine. He whispered her name, not with coldness, but as though it was a prayer, and asked permission to touch her. She had expected him to simply take what tradition and marriage law claimed belonged to him, but he waited, asking instead. Unable to speak, she nodded. His hand rose slowly, brushing her cheek with a gentleness that disarmed her. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as though it was the first moment of true tenderness she had known in years. He told her she was beautiful, his voice filled with surprise as though he had only just realized it. When he kissed her, it was hesitant at first, a testing of unknown waters. But when she responded, threading her fingers into his hair, the kiss deepened, urgent and consuming. His hands moved down her arms and around her waist, pulling her against him until she could feel his heartbeat matching hers. He whispered her name again with a desperation that startled her. Then he asked if she had ever been with anyone before. Heat burned her cheeks as she whispered no, confessing her innocence. The answer affected him deeply. His eyes closed as though he were fighting something inside himself. He said it mattered because he did not want to hurt her, because she deserved something special. When he kissed her again, it was with gentleness that melted the ice she had carried all day. He touched her as though she was sacred, guiding her to the bed with patience and care. For a moment, she could almost believe this marriage was more than an arrangement. Yet when the intimacy deepened, the reality returned, a confusing mix of pleasure and discomfort. She whispered no when pain startled her, and though he hesitated only briefly, he pressed on, murmuring assurances that everything would be all right. She wanted to believe him, but the doubt lingered. Afterward, they lay side by side in silence, both awake, neither able to find words. She turned away, pretending to sleep, but she felt his hand brush her hair in a gesture so tender it nearly made her cry. In the faint light, she saw his vulnerability, the man behind the mask, confessing that he did not know how to be a husband or how to share himself with someone. She admitted she did not know how to be a wife either, and for a fleeting moment, they imagined learning together. She thought something real might be born between them. But then he pulled away, rising from the bed, his voice turning cold again as he said she should sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day. She asked if he would stay, and for a moment she thought he might. But instead he said he had work to do and disappeared into the bathroom, leaving her alone in the bed that still carried his warmth. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still tender from his kiss, wondering if the connection she felt was real or just another illusion. Hours later she finally slept, only to wake to find the bed empty, a single note on the nightstand. Business trip. Back next week. Her heart broke as she read it, realizing he had left her behind without even saying goodbye. What she did not know was that in that single night, more than loneliness had taken root inside her. Life had begun to grow, silently, changing everything that was to come. Days passed in silence, and the Hale mansion felt more like a prison than a home. Nicholas was gone, leaving behind only the note that promised his return but gave no comfort. Elena wandered through endless corridors lined with polished marble and cold glass, her footsteps echoing like reminders of her loneliness. She tried to find distractions. Long walks in the manicured gardens, reading in the vast library, brief conversations with Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, whose politeness never warmed into kindness. Nothing could fill the emptiness of being a wife without a husband, a bride left behind in a stranger's house. Then came the morning when Elena awoke with an unfamiliar heaviness in her body. She sat up slowly, her hand pressed against her stomach as though instinct already knew. At breakfast she tried to eat, but the smell of eggs sent her rushing to the bathroom, her body rebelling. Mrs. Aldridge knocked on the door, her voice edged with concern, but Elena forced a weak smile, insisting it was nothing, perhaps something she ate. Still, a suspicion began to take root, one that left her trembling. She counted the days since the wedding night, replaying the memory of Nicholas's hesitant touch, his sudden tenderness, the way he had asked for permission before holding her. Her hands shook as she realized the truth her body was already whispering. Weeks later, the suspicion became certainty. Elena sat in the quiet office of Dr. Matthews, her hands knotted tightly in her lap, her heart pounding as he looked at her with a gentle smile. He confirmed what she already knew. She was 6 weeks pregnant. The words rang in her ears, both terrifying and miraculous. Pregnant. Nicholas's child was growing inside her. She whispered the question she barely dared to voice, asking if he was sure, and the doctor reassured her, explaining the blood tests had left no doubt. He congratulated her, but she could not mirror his joy. She forced a faint smile, telling him her husband was away on business, while inside, she wondered how Nicholas would react to news of a child born of a marriage he had never truly wanted. The drive back to the mansion, Elena imagined ways she might tell him. Perhaps she would prepare a quiet dinner. Perhaps she would soften the coldness between them with this new life they had created. Maybe, she thought, a baby could bridge the distance, turn duty into love, and give them something real to hold onto. Her heart dared to hope, but the fragile hope shattered the moment she reached the gates of the estate. Reporters swarmed outside like vultures, cameras flashing, microphones raised, voices shouting her name. Mrs. Aldridge met her at the door, her face pale with panic. She handed Elena a newspaper, and when Elena unfolded it, her knees nearly gave out. The headline screamed betrayal, hail scandal, new bride secures fortune with convenient pregnancy. Beneath it was a photograph of her leaving the doctor's office, captured from a distance, her private truth now a weapon for the world to mock. The article was merciless, accusing her of trapping Nicholas, of carefully planning the pregnancy to secure wealth and power. Anonymous sources whispered cruel lies, painting her as a schemer from a bankrupt family who had played her part perfectly. Elena's hands shook so violently she almost dropped the paper. Her heart pounded as rage and humiliation surged together. Someone had leaked what should have been sacred, exposing her most intimate truth and twisting it into a scandal. The phone rang. Reporters demanded statements, but Mrs. Aldridge cut the call short, her eyes heavy with pity. Elena barely heard the words. She was staring out the window, past the cameras, at the black car rolling through the gates. Nicholas was back. Her heart leapt with desperate hope that he would believe her, that he would stand by her, but the look on his face as he stepped through the front door froze her blood. His eyes were colder than ice, the newspaper clutched in his hand. She reached out, whispering his name, but his bitter laugh filled the air like broken glass. He asked what she could possibly explain, accused her of planning everything, of luring him into a marriage, seducing him, and securing her place with calculated precision. She cried that it was not true, begged him to remember it had been their only night together, but his gaze cut through her like a blade. He told her she had seemed too experienced for someone who claimed innocence, dismissing her protests as lies. Tears burned Elena's eyes as she asked how he could think such things. He reminded her of her family's ruin, accused her of using him as an escape, and declared the timing of her pregnancy too convenient to be coincidence. She tried to reach for him, but he recoiled as though her touch was poison. His words shredded the fragile connection they had shared, reducing her to nothing more than a trap in his eyes. In that moment, something inside her broke. The hope, the tenderness, even the fear, all burned away until only anger remained. She lifted her chin, her voice trembling but fierce, declaring that she had been a virgin and could prove it, that she had never needed his fortune, and that he had chosen to believe strangers instead of the woman who carried his child. His certainty faltered for a brief instant, but it was too late. She walked away from him, her tears falling freely, whispering that she had thought a baby might bring them together. But now she knew he wanted only a contract, not a family, not love. She left him standing in the room surrounded by the scattered newspaper pages, while upstairs her heart declared war against the man who had shattered it. The night after Nicholas's return was the longest of Elena's life. She lay awake in the cold bed of the Hale mansion, her tears soaking the pillow, as his words echoed endlessly in her mind. He had accused her of lies, of schemes, of turning his name into scandal, and though her heart had begged him to see the truth, he had chosen suspicion instead of trust. Down the hall she could hear him pacing, restless, the creak of the floorboards carrying through the silence. She pressed her hand against her stomach, whispering to the child within that none of this had been planned, that this life growing inside her was innocent, born not of calculation, but of a single night of fragile connection. Morning light brought no comfort. Reporters still camped outside the gates, their voices rising as soon as movement stirred within the house. Mrs. Aldridge tried to shield her from the noise, but Elena could hear the shouted questions through the walls. Was she proud of trapping him? Did she think the baby would save her? Did she care at all about the shame she had brought to the Hale family name? Each word was like a stone hurled at her chest, and each one reminded her that someone close had betrayed her. Medical records were private, yet the world knew details only a confidant could have revealed. Someone wanted to ruin her, and Nicholas had let himself believe it. When he finally faced her again, his expression was carved from ice. He told her the family's reputation was bleeding in the papers, that she had made him into a fool, and that her timing was too perfect to be chance. She lifted her chin, her voice steady though her heart trembled, and told him she had nothing to gain from lies. She told him she had believed their child might bring hope where none had existed, but his refusal to believe her had killed that hope. He faltered for a moment, his eyes flickering with something she could not name, but the mask returned quickly and he said nothing more. Alone in her room that night, Elena stared into the mirror where her mother once sat each morning. She touched her own reflection, whispering that she could not stay in this house, not where she was seen as a fraud, not where her child would be branded a mistake. Her heart broke with the weight of the decision, but her resolve hardened. She would not raise her child in a place where mistrust poisoned every word. She would not remain bound to a man who saw her as a schemer instead of a wife. The next morning she packed quietly, folding her simple dresses into a single suitcase. She avoided the reporters, slipping out a side door as the staff busied themselves. The mansion loomed behind her, a fortress of wealth and ice, but she did not look back. Her hands tightened on the suitcase handle as the car carried her away, past the flashing cameras, past the voices shouting her name, and toward the only place she could think of where the noise might not follow. She whispered to her child that they would find peace somewhere far from lies and suspicion, somewhere untouched by the Hale name. She did not know yet where the road would end, but she knew this. Her heart was no longer bound to the mansion of a man who had chosen doubt over love. She would find strength, she would find truth, and she would fight for a future that belonged to her and her child alone. The drive carried Elena far from the mansion, away from flashing cameras and the bitter weight of Nicholas's accusations, until the road narrowed into a quiet path lined with trees that whispered in the autumn wind. When the car finally stopped, she stepped out with her single suitcase in hand and looked up at the towering stone walls of the monastery of St. Bridget, its Gothic spires rising against a gray October sky. The air was sharp with the scent of dry leaves and incense, and for the first time in weeks her lungs felt full as she breathed. The driver offered a concerned glance, asking if she was sure she wanted to stay in such an isolated place, but Elena answered with quiet certainty that isolation was exactly what she needed. The heavy wooden door opened before she could knock, revealing a woman in a simple brown habit whose kind eyes softened the harshness of the world outside. She introduced herself as Sister Agnes, her voice warm and welcoming, as though she had been expecting Elena all along. Elena hesitated when asked for her name, almost saying Hale, but stopped and whispered Whitmore instead, realizing she no longer knew what her true identity was. Sister Agnes smiled gently and told her that here she could simply be Elena, that names carried burdens and sometimes it was necessary to let go of them in order to find who she really was. Inside, the monastery was hushed and timeless, its stone corridors echoing with the faint sound of distant voices singing in prayer. Stained, glass windows painted soft colors across the walls, and the stillness seeped into Elena's bones like a balm. Sister Agnes led her to a modest room with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a small window that looked out into a courtyard where other women walked in contemplative silence. Elena placed her suitcase on the bed and sat beside it, exhaustion pressing down on her at last. She laid her hand gently across her still flat stomach and whispered to her unborn child that they were safe now, at least for the moment. The days began to fall into a rhythm that soothed her frayed spirit. At dawn, she joined the nuns for morning prayers, not out of devotion, but because the united voices seemed to carry her fears away. In the garden, she worked alongside them, her hands digging into the damp soil, grounding her in a way the marble halls of the Hale mansion never had. And in the quiet afternoon, she wandered the chapel, her gaze always returning to the grand piano that stood near the altar, polished and waiting. One evening, Sister Agnes found her standing near it, her fingers hovering above the keys. "Do you play?" the nun asked softly. "My mother taught me," Elena admitted, her voice tinged with memory. "But it has been years. Hands never forget what the heart once learned." "Go on," Sister Agnes encouraged with a gentle nod. Elena lowered herself onto the bench, lifting the lid with trembling fingers. The familiar scent of polished wood and ivory keys rose to meet her. She pressed a note, then another, until a simple melody filled the chapel, one her mother Isabel had taught her as a child. The sound was pure, carrying truths she had no words to express. As she played, her eyes stung with tears, and she whispered that her mother always said the piano was a confession, that its music spoke of the heart's deepest secrets. Sister Agnes listened from a nearby pew, her eyes shining with quiet understanding. "And what does your piano confess now?" she asked. Elena closed her eyes as her hands moved across the keys, a melancholy song rising from within her. "That I'm lost, that I'm afraid, that I don't know if I'm strong enough to raise a child alone." Sister Agnes leaned forward, her voice steady and reassuring. "Yet, you are here. You chose to stay. And that choice means more than you know. Sometimes courage begins with admitting fear." That night, lying in her simple room, Elena thought of her mother with a gentleness she hadn't felt in years. Isabel had been full of dreams and sadness, a woman who carried secrets Elena never understood. For the first time, Elena wondered if her mother had faced the same loneliness, the same fear, and if somewhere in that silence lay answers waiting to be uncovered. She pressed her hand to her belly again, whispering a promise to the child within that she would find those answers, no matter how deeply they were buried. 3 weeks passed within the quiet rhythm of the monastery, but Elena's heart refused to rest. Every time she sat at the piano, her fingers wandered through melodies her mother had once played, and with each note memories surfaced, fragments of whispers she had overheard as a child, words spoken in fever when Isabel had been close to the end. A name had slipped from her lips again and again, a name Elena had never understood: Richard. One afternoon, while organizing old sheet music in the chapel, Elena found a folder wedged beneath the piano. Its edges were yellowed with age, and when she opened it, her breath caught. Written in elegant handwriting she knew instantly was her mother's were the words, "Compositions by Isabel Whitmore." Her knees weakened as she held the pages, filled with her mother's music, songs that seemed to bleed with longing and pain. She called out for Sister Agnes, her voice trembling as the nun hurried into the chapel. "These are my mother's," Elena whispered, her hands shaking as she showed the pages. Sister Agnes frowned thoughtfully, her eyes searching memory. "Isabel Whitmore. Yes, that name is familiar." She disappeared into the archives and returned with a worn record book, flipping through its delicate pages until she found what she was looking for. Here it is. Isabel Whitmore stayed here for several months. In the winter of 1999, she came seeking refuge, and she was pregnant at the time. Elena's heart slammed against her chest. "Pregnant?" she asked, her voice nearly breaking. Yes, Sister Agnes confirmed, her tone heavy with meaning. She spoke often of a man. She loved a man she could not be with. His name was Richard. Elena's fingers clutched the music sheets as the truth began to flicker in her mind like a flame she couldn't yet control. Richard. The same name whispered on her mother's deathbed. The same name written in letters Elena had once found, but never understood. She was hiding, Elena murmured, tears burning her eyes. Just like I am. Sometimes daughters walk the same paths their mothers once walked, Sister Agnes said gently. But that doesn't mean they must share the same destiny. That night, Elena stayed awake long after prayers ended, spreading her mother's music across the small wooden table in her room. The notes seemed alive beneath her fingertips, carrying pain, hope, and secrets Isabel had never spoken. On the last page, written in delicate handwriting, was a message that made Elena's heart race. For my daughter, who will one day understand that true love is worth any sacrifice. May she be braver than I was. May she claim what is rightfully hers. The truth is waiting. Elena pressed the page to her chest as tears slipped down her cheeks. Her mother had known. She had left behind a trail, a promise, and a plea for Elena to uncover what had been hidden. She placed her hands protectively on her growing belly and whispered to her child that she would find the truth, that she would uncover the secrets Isabel had carried in silence, and that she would never allow the same mistakes to chain them both. Outside, the wind howled through the monastery trees as though carrying the voices of the past. Elena listened, her heart no longer resigned to grief but burning with determination. She did not know yet where the path would lead, but she knew this. Her mother's secrets were not buried forever, and she would not rest until she uncovered them. Elena's days at the monastery had begun to feel almost steady, but the peace she clung to was fragile, and it shattered the moment heavy footsteps echoed through the stone corridors. They were not the soft steps of nuns or the quiet shuffle of visitors. These were firm, deliberate, and male. Sister Agnes met the sound with a polite but guarded voice asking who was there. The answer made Elena's blood freeze. My name is Vincent Hale. I'm looking for Elena. The moment she heard it, she knew, though she had never met him before. Nicholas's half-brother. His voice was smooth yet edged with something darker, a quality that made the air in the monastery feel suddenly dangerous. Elena gathered the scattered pages of her mother's music and pressed them to her chest, whispering, a silent plea for strength. Minutes later, Sister Agnes entered the library where Elena sat, her face troubled. There's a man asking for you. He says he's family. Elena wanted to refuse, to hide, but something stronger than fear urged her forward. Curiosity, perhaps, or the sense that the path to truth had finally reached her door. I'll see. She said quietly. Vincent was waiting in the small parlor reserved for guests. He stood as she entered, his smile polite but hollow, his eyes dark and calculating. He looked nothing like Nicholas's cold composure. Instead, his presence radiated something slippery, like charm masking venom. He extended his hand and introduced himself with false warmth. Elena shook it briefly, unsettled by how damp and cold his touch felt. I came out of concern, he said smoothly, settling back into his chair without invitation. When we heard you left Nicholas, we were all very worried. My mother especially. You must know how cruel the press has been. Those stories about you, terrible things, really unfair. Elena kept her expression calm, though inside her heart raced. She asked why he had come himself rather than Nicholas or this mother he mentioned. His smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. Because I wanted to speak to you personally. Because I believe misunderstandings can be resolved if we are practical. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Especially with your condition. His gaze dropped to her belly, now beginning to show, and Elena instinctively wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. He spoke of reputation, of inheritance, of how complicated things would become once the child was born. Then he made his proposal. He offered her a financial agreement, generous enough to secure her future. But in exchange, she would renounce any rights she or the baby might have to the Hale fortune. His words dripped with false sympathy as though he was doing her a favor. Elena's pulse quickened. "And what rights would those be?" she asked, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "As Nicholas's wife," Vincent replied, "you have certain claims, and as his child's mother even more so. But if you walk away now, sign the papers I've prepared, no one needs to suffer further humiliation. You'll be safe, comfortable, and forgotten." She rose from her chair and walked to the window, staring out at the peaceful monastery garden. "Why are you really here, Vincent? Why not Nicholas? Why not your mother?" His mask slipped just for an instant. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardening before he smoothed his expression again. "Nicholas is busy, and my mother thought it best that I handle this." "Or perhaps you have your own reasons," Elena said slowly, turning to face him. "Perhaps you know more about me than you should. Perhaps you even know about my mother, Isabel." The reaction was immediate. His face paled, his eyes widening with a flicker of fear before he quickly composed himself. "I've never heard that name," he said too quickly, but Elena had seen the truth in his expression. "Liar," she whispered. His smile vanished. He stood abruptly, moving toward the door, but not before delivering words that chilled her blood. "You are making a mistake, Elena. A very big mistake. Ask too many questions about the Hale family and you might not like the answers. Sometimes bad things happen to people who go looking for truths better left buried." His eyes flicked to her stomach with an unspoken threat. Then he was gone, leaving behind the echo of his footsteps and the suffocating scent of expensive cologne. Sister Agnes hurried to her side, worry etched across her face. "Are you all right?" she asked, steadying Elena's trembling hands. Elena nodded faintly, her voice low but resolute. "He knew my mother. He knows something about her. And he's desperate to keep me from finding out." She placed both hands over her belly, feeling the faint stir of life within. "I won't let him scare me. I'm going to find the truth, no matter what it costs." After Vincent's visit, the peace of the monastery was shattered. Elena felt eyes on her even in the stillness of the chapel, as though shadows lingered where he had stood. She knew now that her mother's past and the Hale family were intertwined, and Vincent's fear had only confirmed that there were secrets buried deep. She could not rest until she uncovered them. Sister Agnes, seeing her unrest, quietly guided her to the archives beneath the monastery, a place of locked cabinets and records dating back generations. Together they searched through birth registries, letters and donation ledgers until Sister Agnes paused at a page written in a careful hand. "Here," she whispered. Elena leaned in, her breath catching as she read the name Richard Hale. He had donated large sums to the monastery during the same winter her mother had stayed there. His name appeared again and again, attached to notes of visits, requests for updates, even the sponsorship of Isabel's stay. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Richard Hale, patriarch of the family, Nicholas's father. The man her mother had whispered about in her fevered dreams. Her trembling hand traced the ink as if by touching it, she could bridge decades of silence. Sister Agnes's voice was gentle, but firm. "Your mother came here carrying more than sorrow. She carried the child of a man she loved but could never claim. This proves it." Elena pressed her hands over her stomach, her voice breaking as the truth fell into place. "Richard Hale was my mother's lover, and that means—" She swallowed the words, the weight of them too heavy, but Sister Agnes spoke them for her. "That means you are Richard's daughter." The room spun, the stone walls pressing in on her as the reality crashed over her. She was not just the wife of Nicholas Hale. She was his half-sister. Their single night of fragile connection, their unborn child, it was all tangled in a web of bloodlines and betrayal. She staggered back, clutching the edge of the wooden table for balance. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It can't be," but the truth was undeniable. The timelines matched, the names matched, and Vincent's reaction had confirmed it. He had known all along. That was why he wanted her silenced, why he had come himself instead of Nicholas. If the truth came to light, The Hale family would be destroyed. Elena's tears blurred the ink on the page as she whispered to her unborn child that none of this was their fault. The child was innocent. A life caught in the storm of choices made long before either of them existed. But she knew the world would not see it that way. The scandal would be catastrophic. The whispers, merciless. Sister Agnes placed a steady hand on her shoulder. The truth is painful, but it is also freeing. You have lived in shadows without knowing why. Now you see clearly. What you do with that truth is what matters. Elena lifted her gaze, fire burning through her despair. Vincent and Lucille, they will use this against me. They will try to destroy me before I can expose them, but I won't let them. My mother's secret will not be buried any longer. As she clutched the faded documents to her chest, the decision crystallized. She would uncover everything, no matter how dangerous it became. The blood in her veins carried the truth of the Hale legacy, and for the sake of her child, she would not be silenced. Far away beyond the monastery walls, Vincent Hale poured himself a glass of whiskey and smiled coldly as he told his mother, Lucille, that their problem was no longer sleeping quietly in a convent. Elena had begun digging, and soon she would know everything. Lucille's lips curved into a thin, merciless smile. Then it's time we remind her what happens to those who dig too deep. The days after Elena uncovered the truth were filled with a tension that never loosened. Every creak of the monastery's wooden floors, every distant echo in the stone, corridors made her heart race. She knew Vincent would not stay silent. He had warned her, and men like him never gave empty threats. She kept her mother's documents hidden beneath the floorboards of her small room, clutching them at night like a shield, whispering promises to her unborn child that she would protect them no matter what it cost. The storm came one evening when the chapel bells rang for prayer. Elena was walking back through the courtyard when the sound of engines shattered the stillness. Headlights cut through the trees, and black cars rolled through the gates with the force of an invasion. The nuns rushed to lock the doors, but before the bolts could slide into place, Vincent was already inside, his tall frame filling the entryway, his smile sharp and cruel. Beside him stood Lucille Hale, her beauty aged but her eyes colder than stone, and behind them 2 men with the hardened look of hired enforcers. Sister Agnes stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear, demanding that they leave this sacred place. Vincent only laughed, a sound that sent chills down Elena's spine. Sacred places are still mortal, sister, he said smoothly. And mortals bleed. His gaze fell on Elena, and he moved toward her with predatory calm. Elena stood her ground, though her knees trembled. Stay away from me. You should have taken the offer, Vincent replied, his voice low and menacing. You could have disappeared quietly, but instead you dug into graves that were better left untouched. Now you know too much, and that makes you dangerous to me, to my mother, to the entire Hale name. Lucille's voice cut through the air like ice. We cannot afford scandals, not this one. It ends tonight. The enforcers moved forward, and Elena stumbled back, her hands instinctively covering her stomach. Before they reached her, the sound of another engine roared outside. A door slammed, hurried footsteps pounded across the stone floor, and Nicholas burst into the monastery, his face pale with fury, his blue eyes blazing. He shoved one of the men aside and positioned himself between Elena and Vincent. Don't you dare touch her, Nicholas growled, his voice raw with rage. Vincent smirked. Ah, little brother, always late to the party. Do you know who she really is? Do you know whose blood runs in her veins? Of course not, because she only tells you what you want to hear. Nicholas's jaw tightened, but his gaze never left Elena. I don't care what lies you've twisted. She's my wife. She's carrying my child, and you will not harm them. The room exploded into chaos. One of the enforcers lunged, and Nicholas fought with the desperation of a man who knew everything depended on this moment. Sister Agnes pulled Elena toward safety, but Lucille drew a pistol from her coat, her hand steady, her eyes merciless. She aimed directly at Elena's heart. Nicholas saw the movement, shouted her name, and threw himself in front of her just as the gun fired. The sound cracked through the monastery like thunder. Elena screamed as Nicholas staggered, blood spreading across his shirt. He dropped to his knees, but even as he fell, his hand reached for hers, gripping her tightly, anchoring her to him. The nuns rushed forward, some screaming, some praying, and in the chaos another shot rang out, this one wild, ricocheting against the stone. Elena clutched Nicholas, her tears falling onto his face as she begged him not to leave her. Not now. Not like this. He tried to speak, his lips forming her name, but before he could finish, his body went limp in her arms. The shock of the moment tore through her, and the pain in her body surged like a wave. She doubled over, clutching her stomach, as a new kind of agony consumed her. The child inside her was coming far too soon. Sister Agnes shouted for help, her voice urgent and commanding, as the world blurred around Elena. Vincent cursed. Lucille pulled him back, and the enforcers dragged them out as the monasteries. Bells tolled wildly in the night. Elena's cries echoed through the halls as she was carried toward safety, her body torn between the agony of labor and the terror of losing Nicholas. She held onto consciousness only by whispering to her unborn child that they had to survive, that no matter what darkness surrounded them, she would bring them into the light. The world became a blur of sound and light as Elena was rushed from the monastery, her body racked with pain, her arms still stained with Nicholas's blood. Sirens wailed through the night, the rhythm of her cries mingling with the distant toll of bells. She clung to consciousness only by whispering her child's name, though the name itself had not yet been chosen, a promise that this little one would live, a plea that fate would not take everything from her. At the hospital, she was wheeled beneath blinding lights, voices shouting orders, hands pushing and pulling as doctors fought for two lives at once. She caught fragments of their words. Premature, blood loss, stabilize him, prepare her. And though fear clawed at her, she focused only on the faint beat she felt deep within her, the fragile rhythm of her baby's heart. She prayed silently, to a God she had not called upon in years, begging him to spare her child. Hours passed in a haze of pain until finally a cry split the air, sharp and insistent, the sound of new life demanding to be heard. Tears spilled down Elena's face as the doctor placed the tiny swaddled form against her chest. She kissed the damp forehead and whispered a promise that no matter what had been done to them, this child would grow surrounded not by lies and greed, but by truth and love. She whispered that they had already survived the impossible together, and nothing would break them now. But even as relief filled her, her heart ached with dread for Nicholas. She asked for him with trembling lips, but the nurse hesitated before answering. His condition was critical. The bullet had torn through his shoulder and chest, and he had lost too much blood. He was in surgery, fighting for his life. Elena closed her eyes, clutching the baby tighter, whispering that he had to survive, that they still had unfinished truths to face, that their story could not end in blood and silence. When dawn, finally, broke, soft light spilling into the sterile hospital room, the door opened quietly. Nicholas was wheeled in, pale and weak but alive, his eyes fluttering open to find her. Relief so fierce it nearly broke her poured from her soul as she whispered his name. His gaze fell to the child in her arms, and for the first time since their wedding, his icy composure shattered. Tears welled in his blue eyes as he reached out with a trembling hand, touching the baby's cheek with reverence. "She looks like you," he whispered, his voice raw and fragile. Elena smiled through her tears. "She looks like hope." For a moment there was only silence between them, filled with the unspoken truths they had both carried. The lies, the betrayals, the bloodlines that twisted their fates, none of it mattered in that fragile moment. What mattered was survival. What mattered was the child. What mattered was the possibility that love, though broken and bruised, could still be born out of ruin. Nicholas's hand found hers, his grip weak but steady. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice breaking. "About you, about everything. If I have another chance, Elena, I'll spend it proving I can be the man you deserve." She bent over him, pressing her forehead to his. whispering that second chances were all they had left, and that this time she would not let fear or lies dictate their lives. The child stirred in her arms, a small cry filling the room, and Elena knew that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something entirely new. Beyond the hospital walls, the Hale Empire still waited. Vincent and Lucille still plotted, and secrets still lingered in the shadows. But in that room, in that fragile dawn, Elena chose not to fear the future. She chose to believe that truth was stronger than lies, that love could grow even from betrayal, and that a child's first cry could rewrite a destiny.